So now that America had declared war, they still had to get their army ready. And so the USA actually took an entire year to build their army before they were able to join the fight in force. However, that entire year, the Allies, the Triple Entente, were having a really hard time in Europe. Their friends were starting to lose. Germany was starting to sink ships, and over the course of this year, they sank 844 ships, which was really a crazy amount. It was so much that one of the top naval officers, meaning the Navy, a ship officer in Great Britain, was saying Germany will win the war if America doesn't step in and help out. And so the Americans tried to help out with their Navy right away. And in order to keep their supply flow of, weapons and food and all the kinds of things that people need to fight war, they sent, instead of sending one ship at a time that could easily get destroyed by the U-boats of the Germans, they sent convoys. They used a convoy system, which is a one light and fast destroyer travels with a whole bunch of ships and protects them. And those destroyers are good at hunting the submarines, good at hunting the U-boats and taking them out. So that one destroyer would protect a whole bunch of ships, allowing them to get to their places a lot more safely, and that really dropped the losses dramatically of merchant ships. And the first troops that came across to Europe were more of a symbolic force than anything, but they were called the American Expeditionary Force. And they were led by John J. Pershing. He was this leader of this group of soldiers that were the first one coming across. He was actually, at that time, still running after Pancho Villa that we talked about before, who had crossed and trying to pursue him into Mexico. But this was more important, and so they pulled him off of that and put him in charge of these American soldiers. Now, these American soldiers really wanted to, no matter what, to fight on their own because they felt like America, being not one of the top powers in the world, needed to prove that they were one of the top powers in the world. And the way that they wanted to do this was to show that they could win battles on their own. And in order to, or because they want to, or the reason that they want to show that is because they want to continue to have influence and be one of the most powerful nations possible after the war. They wanted to have input and influence after that. And on June 1917, the very first troops arrived, and really all they could do was help out French morale. And so morale, they weren't really even helping the French fight, but I'm gonna write in the word here because it kind of went away, but all they were trying to do was get the French to be excited and be able to fight some more so that they knew that help was coming. And so it was really a symbol of commitment. And so they marched them through the cities in France, and there were crowds that cheered and threw flowers at the American soldiers and were so excited to see them. They come and help them. They saw them as people that were going to come and save the day. But again, the Allies were having really, really big problems. First off, the British were advancing against Germany, but as they were advancing, they got into Belgium, and it was a very rainy season, and the mud slowed them down and didn't allow them to move forward, and the tanks were bogged down, and they just couldn't move anymore. And so they ended up getting stuck back in trench lines again, where they were stuck just facing or staring across no man's land at other people, and people just dying day by day by day. Also, Austria-Hungary was having many victories against Italy and advancing across Europe in the south, which was a scary thing because eventually France could be completely circled by the enemy. And so that was kind of bad too. And also in Russia, the Bolsheviks, a group of people, wanted peace for Russia. They wanted it to be a peaceful thing. And so there are all kinds of Russians that were leaving the army and going absent without leave. And so that's AWOL, if you've heard that before. It means you're leaving the material or the military and nobody said you could. And so that's actually against the law. And so one of these Bolsheviks, which is this radical faction that took over the government, was Vladimir Lenin, and we have a picture of him, the bald man right here in the middle. Okay, and he was the leader of the Bolsheviks, and he was starting to try and get Russia moved towards communism. And the idea of communism is right here. Okay, communism is this. Okay, it's getting rid of all the social classes and all the property rights, and everybody shares everything. So nobody's a higher class person than anybody else, and nobody owns anything. All the people share what they have. And so in order to do this, in order to push towards communism better, Lenin decided he didn't want to be fighting a war, and so he signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. And the Brest-Litovsk Treaty says that Russia will make peace with Germany, and actually, what ended up happening is Russia was willing to give up 30% of their land as well, just to stop the fighting and be able to come back to peace. This caused huge problems for the Allies because they used to have a two-front war where Germany was fighting on both sides, and now all of a sudden Germany can take all their troops away from the Russian side and fight only against France. And so they were able to push a whole lot faster. This push that the Germans went on was called the Peace Offensive. I've always thought the Peace Offensive is kind of a funny name because if you're offensive, if you're attacking, then you're not really trying to make peace. But the whole idea was Germans wanted to attack and send their people in so that they could beat the Allies and bring peace. They wanted peace, but they wanted it on their terms, on German terms, not on the Allies' terms. And so they pushed in as quickly as they could. They realizing kind of that the Americans couldn't help for 2 months, and so they pushed and they pushed and they pushed, and they were pushing the French and the British back, and the Germans got extremely close to Paris. They got within 50 miles of Paris at a place called Chateau Thierry. As a matter of fact, they got so close that 1 million people from Paris were evacuated, and they actually left the city being worried that the Germans were going to take over Paris, and the Americans showed up just in time to fight at Chateau Thierry. So the Americans and French were able to stop that offensive from the Germans, and they counterattacked. They attacked back at a place called Belleau Wood. And in Belleau Wood, the Germans, it was a forest, a thick forest, where the Germans had all kinds of defenses set up. They had barbed wire set up and artillery and hidden machine guns and all kinds of stuff that was extremely deadly. But the United States Marines ran in there and were willing to fight it out, and they just continued to fight and fight and fight, and they had really heavy losses. A lot of Marines died as well, but they were able to drive the Germans out of Belleau Wood. And a lot of the fighting, it got to the point where in this really thick forest, you really didn't even see a person to shoot at him, and often you were too close to shoot by the time you got there, and a lot of the fighting and killing was done hand to hand with things like bayonets and knives and things like that. Okay. By the end of 1918, about 800,000 Germans were dead from the peace offensive and the attack at Belleau Wood. Then the next battle that happened was the Second Battle of the Marne. And in the Second Battle of the Marne, the Germans pushed forward once more, and the new allies, with the Americans participating, about 250,000 Americans participated in the Second Battle of the Marne, were able to push them back and move them closer and closer back to Germany. The final battle we'll talk about here is the Battle of Argonne Forest, and the Germans were weakened. They didn't have anybody to back them up, and the Americans had come in to back up the other side, and the Germans had the blockade up, so they didn't have very many supplies that got to them because of the British blockade, and they had terrible case of the flu, influenza. People were dying, and the Germans were losing their will to fight. And so slowly at first, the Germans started to give up some territory, and then it sped up, and lots of territory was lost in the Battle of Argonne Forest and gained by the Americans. And so at this point, the German leaders had realized they had lost and they needed to give up. They had to figure it out. They realized that they didn't have any troops as backup, any reserves troops that could, no fresh groups of soldiers that could come in and back their guys up. But the Americans had just come in and given millions of fresh soldiers to the Allies. And so they realized that there was no way that they could win. And they were starting to lose major battles, and they didn't have enough supplies, and there was the flu, and all kinds of stuff was happening. And so they decided to try to get an armistice. And an armistice is kind of interesting. It's not an end of the war. It's not a treaty. It doesn't make peace, but what it does is it does a pause button on the war. So you stop fighting the war and you start peace talks. So the treaty is the stop button, but this was the armistice. And the armistice happened on November 11th. And so from then on, November 11th was called Armistice Day in America, and later on that switched over to what we now call Veterans Day, because instead of just celebrating the veterans of World War I with Armistice Day, they changed it so that it would celebrate all the veterans that have fought in any war for the Americans. Okay, and so what were the rules of the armistice? Well, France and Britain made the rules, and both France and Britain wanted it to be extremely harsh. And so they said, if you want a pause button and start talking peace, then here's what you have to do, Germans. First off, the Germans all had to pull back their troops from the Western Front, pull them out of France, pull them out of Belgium, and bring them back to Germany. They did not want any troops to be looking at them across the lines on no man's land. The second thing they wanted was for the Germans to cancel the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk so that they no longer had a treaty with Russia. They also said that the Germans had to give up all of their U-boats. They had to give them all to the Allies, so they didn't have any more U-boats that they could fight with. And the last thing, and the most important one, was that the Kaiser, the leader of the Germans, Kaiser Wilhelm, had to give up his throne. And this is the big thing that Wilson wanted, because again, Wilson wanted democracy. He did not like the idea of one emperor being in charge, and that was what Kaiser Wilhelm was. He was the emperor of Germany. And so, like I said, the armistice ended on 11/11/1918. Actually, it ended at 11 a.m. and it caused, there were very heavy casualties in the war, but the war ended on this day. In all, about 10 million people died in this war, and that was more people than had died in the last 100 years of war in Europe, and so it was a very large number with 10 million dying. France lost about 1.3 million, Britain lost about 0.9 million. Germany lost 1.6 million people. Russia, 1.7 million died, and the Americans were only there for less than a year, and they also lost 50,000 people. So there were a lot of deaths that happened because of this war, which is why it was such an important thing to celebrate the armistice when it came. And so Woodrow Wilson, what he really wanted, he was trying to decide what he wanted for the peace, what he wanted for the treaty, and so he wrote down the 14 points of peace that he wanted. It was his plan for a peace that would last forever. He liked the idea of actually having a peace where another war wouldn't come out of it. Okay, and so his plan for peace had 14 different points, and really 1 through 5 dealt with the isms. It dealt with the main causes of the World War I. And so the takeaway, or the first 1 through 3, started to take away imperialism, where countries would not take countries over anymore or anything like that. And number 4 had to deal with militarism, but we're looking at no more secret international agreements. So we don't want to have hidden stuff where one country agrees with another country, I'll help you, but I want to take over this land, which is kind of what Teddy Roosevelt did with the Panama Canal. Also wanted freedom of the seas, where nobody owned the seas, and so everybody could be in the water, and they should be safe. Wanted free trade as well as smaller armies. And 6 through 13 dealt with the territory, and basically what they did is they took these big empires of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman empires, and they broke them apart into smaller pieces. Number 14 was the most important one for Number 14 was the most important for Woodrow Wilson. He wanted to set up an international organization that was set up to maintain world peace. And he said the principle of justice to all peoples and nationalities, whether they be strong or weak, should be upheld and should be maintained. And so he's basically saying we need to create this thing called the League of Nations, and it needs to help, or all these countries need to help each other and argue and debate and things like that to fix problems before they turn into war. That's what he really wanted and thought would work best. And so at the Paris Peace Conference, the Big Four were all there. They were called the Big Four. They were the major leaders of the winning countries. And so Woodrow Wilson, the leader of the USA, was there, and Georges Clemenceau, the leader of France, was there, and David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, was there, and Vittorio Orlando, the leader of Italy, was there. And they were all arguing and trying to decide what are the terms going to be for peace. What are we going to do? How are we going to decide what we need to do to Germany, and how peace should work? And so a lot of them didn't agree with Wilson. And remember, Wilson had this idea that he just wanted peace without victory. He wanted there to be peace that could stay forever, where it wasn't rubbing it in the face of the loser. And so the other countries, what they wanted was harsh punishments for Germany. They wanted them to really pay for what they had done. They had killed millions of their people. And so the other thing that happened is the British and the French already had these secret treaties to set up to break up those Central Power nations and kind of take them over, or give different people the control over them. And so in order to get help during the war, they had to make these secret treaties with different people. And so they finally decided on the Treaty of Versailles. And really, in the negotiations of the Treaty of Versailles, Woodrow Wilson had to give up a lot of the things that he wanted just to get his most important thing, which was point number 14. And so what ended up happening is they decided that they were going to take away the German borderlands. They had to take away the edges of Germany that they had gotten in unfair ways, and they took away the German colonies away as well. And so basically all of Germany that was owned by, or everything that was owned by Germany that wasn't Germany, was taken away from them and given to other countries. Germany also had to take full responsibility of the war. They had to say it was our fault completely. And so because it was their fault completely, Germany had to pay huge amounts of reparations, a giant amount of money. And so they basically had to pay for all of the damage that the war had caused. They had to pay it to the other countries. And so this was a huge bill that they couldn't possibly pay. The other thing that happened is they had to set limits on how big the German military was, and they set these limits at very, very small. So the German military can never get big enough again under these rules. And the last thing that it did that Woodrow Wilson got, so none of those other things were things Woodrow Wilson wanted, but what Woodrow Wilson ended up getting is he got his League of Nations. Okay, and again, this League of Nations is a place for countries to settle their problems, and it's Woodrow Wilson's most important part of the whole thing. And so what it did do, however, was it caused a lot, this Treaty of Versailles caused a lot of German anger, because they didn't really get any say in it at all, and the Germans were angry and poor because they had to pay these reparations, and it ended up costing them it ended up causing the Second World War would come out of this. So of course, with Woodrow Wilson getting what he wanted, the Americans were going to sign it, right? No, they actually didn't. They didn't want to. Wilson came back and he said to Congress, you need to sign the treaty. We must lead the world down a new path where we have peace among nations. And so he wanted this League of Nations. He wanted America to be a leader of it. And so a lot of people in America were against it. They didn't like the idea, and one of them was Henry Cabot Lodge. And Henry Cabot Lodge said that the League of Nations would limit what the U.S. can do to make themselves better, because they couldn't act on their own in their own interest. They couldn't act just for America. If they wanted to do anything, they had to think about all these other countries that they were connected to through the League of Nations before they did anything, and they didn't like that. They wanted to be able to do whatever they wanted. And so so Wilson was running around the country touring it and trying to get support for it and doing everything that he could, and he went 8,000 miles by train in 3 weeks and gave 40 speeches, and he rejected compromise. He said, I will not take out the League of Nations. We absolutely will not do it. And so Senate eventually voted on it, and they rejected the treaty. And so this League of Nations that Wilson had set up was now without America in it, and it left that League of Nations with no power at all. And so the huge problems that were about to come up in the 1930s couldn't be fixed by any group because that group had basically no power. And so as you can see, the worry was that all these other countries were going to tie our hands behind our back, because there's America with its hands tied behind its back by the League of Nations. Okay, and even though Woodrow Wilson loved it, the people didn't like it. They saw it as kind of keeping us from doing what we wanted and needed to do. So there were also problems that cropped up immediately after the war, making kind of that post-war time a really tough time to be alive in America. And so the first thing that happened is in 1918, starting and on to 1919, there was a worldwide influenza epidemic. So there was flu, and there were 500,000 people that died in the U.S., which is more than did in the entire war. I mean, 10 times more than died in the war. And worldwide, the flu killed more people than died in the entire 4 years of World War I, which is kind of crazy. The second thing that happened is there was really a lot of unemployment as the soldiers came back, because the women and African Americans had taken over their jobs. Their jobs were now full, and so they didn't have any way to get a job and make money. The other things that happened is the unions that were in America were denying pay raises, and so in 1919 about 20% of the workers went on strike, and so the factories were not being run, and they were kind of running out of productive labor, good workers. And then last but not least, the Red Scare occurred, and people were really afraid of communism, and so Lenin had called it a worldwide workers' revolution, and so they saw this strike that was going on in 1919, and they thought, uh-oh, our country's turning into a communist country, and they definitely didn't want that to happen. And so they started to try and shut down communism in any way they could, and General A. Mitchell Palmer started to do Palmer raids, and what they would do is any immigrant that they suspected of having any radical views, they would raid them and they would deport them and get rid of them, and ended up with about over 4,000 people being arrested and deported in 33 different cities because they were seen to be connected with communism.